Many of you know that Mr. Bracy, a postman, had gotten off work, and as he was traveling home, he was stopped, he was followed 4 or 5 blocks by San Rafael police officers, and ultimately was stopped, detained, got out of the car was searched, handcuffed, and ultimately let go. The reason why this case is so disturbing to me, even though it's not a huge case in the traditional George Floyd type case, it is a case that's reflective of what happens to African Americans on a routine basis in various police agencies. They go unreported, undetected, but it creates a scar on the membrane and the body politics of the African American community. This is a case of that kind. Mr. Bracy has no criminal record. He has worked as a U.S. postal employee for 21 years here in the city of San Rafael, and essentially had his personal dignity insulted, his personal sense of citizenship insulted by being improperly stopped and detained. Now, I say all that to say that first there was, the basis of this, there had been a carjacking by 3 people, 2 men and a woman. No information was given about these 3 people. There was no indication of their race, their age, the description of them, any clothing, nothing. And they had no information about the license plate of the car. And so essentially what happens here is that Mr. Bracy, who is driving a 211 Malibu, white Malibu, which I will show you, is stopped. The person who committed the crime, that car was a 217 Impala, white as well. Our problem here is that there was ample opportunity for the police, before they stopped Mr. Bracy, to determine and get more information about what had taken place. The officers were on dispatch. They could have found out if they had any information about the race, the age, more than just the sex, the clothing, direction, anything. And it's very disturbing because all you really had was a black man in a car, a white car. And that should not have been enough in and of itself to stop him when you could have done more. Mr. Bracy was followed for about 4 or 5 main blocks for about 5 minutes. And the police officer comes up behind him. The car has on it a clear indication that it's a Malibu. Let me show you. Malibu, not Impala. And that should have been enough notice for the officer to say, I don't think this is the right car. The officer even then says, this is the part that's disturbing, he is driving, he says he is following behind a white Impala, which was not true. How could he make that kind of assumption and statement unless he really was not being thorough in his way and he had made up his mind that he was going to stop this car? We believe that at the time the officer got behind Mr. Bracy, he knew he was a black man because Mr. Bracy had just come out of the 7-Eleven store and the officers were standing by, sitting by, and there was eye-to-eye contact with Mr. Bracy looking at them and they're looking at him. Mr. Bracy became nervous about that, of course, because a black man in America, he did not want to engage in any kind of driving pattern that would cause the officers to stop him. But the officers continued to follow him for the 4 or 5 blocks. They made no effort to find out whether or not that car had a registration on it, that Mr. Bracy, because they could have easily, once they stopped that car, if they'd have made that effort, they could have asked Mr. Bracy, was this your car? And he would have said yes. Mr. Bracy was in his uniform. There was no indication from police dispatcher that the man who committed this robbery was in uniform or whether he was a postal employee. These are things that should have alerted a reasonable police officer that this is not the right guy, but yet they went full steam ahead. An officer who actually, when the car was stopped, says to another officer on a tape, I don't think this is the right car. One, you have the Malibu, you have a black guy in the car, there's no indication. So it is easy for the police to contend that was just a routine stop and it was a routine mistake. I understand they can do that. The question is, did they act reasonably to determine whether they had sufficient facts at hand to stop this car? Our position is, no, they did not. And no, they did not. We know it was a black man in the car. There was no indication that a black man was involved in this particular incident, but yet he was stopped and treated in the manner in which he was. So this has been a disturbing event for Mr. Bracy. He had no criminal record. He's been very careful not to be engaged in police in any way. And for him to try to get through this, he was trying to do the best he can to keep the police from thinking he was a bad guy. He tried to talk to him, tried to tell him he was a postman. It was all ignored. But the officers made no effort to give due consideration as to who he was. And it was clear that he was not the person. So we filed this lawsuit on the grounds that there was no legitimate probable cause that a reasonable police officer would have believed that this was a person. A reasonable police officer would have gotten more information from dispatch to determine that they knew the race of the people, how many people were involved, the clothing decision, the age of the person, and they had time to do all of that before they stopped Mr. Lacy. And even more importantly, they trailed him for 5 blocks, and he was followed him. You could see as close as they was that it was a Malibu that was the car, not a Impala. The officer claims that he was riding behind an Impala. That clearly was not true. And so that's why I say it's a series of mistakes that we believe were motivated in part because there was a hunch, but no evidence that this black man driving the car must have been involved. And that's the part that's most disturbing, because that goes to the citizenship, that goes to the disrespect that you had, and gave no due consideration to the fact that this could be wrong, and no consideration the harm that happens to a person when that person is at gunpoint. There were 6 officers with gunpoint on him. In a case that was at best a carjacking, but people you didn't know. So that kind of fear is one that we cannot underestimate and fail to give due consideration. And what I want to do here before I have Mr. Bracy talk, let me go through it and I'll answer questions. The reason why we're so concerned, this is the route that was followed here. Mr. Bracy goes to this 7-Eleven store, okay? He gets a bottle of water. He had come from work, the post office place he come from. And so he goes up, when he comes out of 7-Eleven, there are 3 police cars right next to this homeless shelter. The officers look over at him, he looks at them, he has his windows down, he's kind of nervous about it, but he says, okay, I haven't done anything. He gets in his car and he drives down this street, 2nd Street, these number of blocks. The officer was right behind him for this entire period of time. Mr. Bracy was thinking that maybe he's going to pass him up because he's looking for someone else, but no, he didn't. So our contention is, while he's following this period, the officer had ample time to call dispatcher and see if he had more information. Did he have information about the race of the person, the age of the person, the clothing description of the person, and any other things that would have been helpful for a reasonable police officer to determine, am I following the right car? And along this route, the officer says, I'm following a white Malibu. Well, he could only make that statement if he got close enough to the car, but the car was not a Malibu. He said, I'm following an Impala. He said, I'm following a white Impala. Well, the car that was supposed to be the suspect car was an Impala. But this car that Mr. Bracy was driving was not that. It was, in fact, a Malibu. And so he's followed along this route. It's been a long period of time, and he's ultimately stopped here. Our view is there was ample time for the police to get more information, but instead, a parade of officers then got involved in this. And by the time they got here, there were 4 officers there with guns drawn as he's directed to get out of the car, and later 2 more officers come. So what is a person to think who was a postal worker, who was an ordinary guy? All of a sudden he's at gunpoint with 6 officers showing up at him, and he hadn't done anything, and he doesn't know. This is the era of the George Floyd and some of the cases that are taking place. But this is the route. This is why it's so disturbing to us. Okay? And then obviously he pulled out of the car. You can see immediately he has his uniform on. That in and of itself should cause a reasonable police officer to think, you know, we may not have the right person here. But they knew beforehand, an officer before this happened had said that I don't think we have the right car. Our view is they could have easily gotten the right information long before, but they did not. So then I move over here to the cars. Now, this is his car. I mean, this is a picture taken by the police, but the Malibu sign is there. This is a better picture of it, Malibu, that we took of it. But clearly Malibu, not Impala. That clearly should have been reason enough for the officers to think at that moment, this is not the right car and should have peeled off. Or they should have said, give us more information. And they didn't do that. So, but yet, by not doing that, he gets pulled out of the car. He has to walk backwards here. Ultimately, you know, he's trying to tell them I'm a postman, and I'm my postman. And they ultimately put him in handcuffs and put him in the backseat of the car. And then after 5 to 8 minutes or so, he was released. It may not seem much to other folks, but I'm going to tell you, 5 to 8 minutes with gun pointed at you, you don't know whether any moves you make could result in your death, is something to be afraid of and to be scared from, particularly and especially as a black man in America, which he is. And so that's why this case is important to us. You can excuse it, the police can say it's justifiable, it was reasonable, but the more reasonable point of view would have been to found out, got more information when you could have gotten that information, and you didn't get that information, and that ultimately resulted in him being pulled out of the car, detained, and handcuffed. That's why we filed this lawsuit. Okay, I want to talk to Mr. Bracy. After Mr. Bracy talk, I have his son, his brother, his cousin, you know, we're all family friends of his, and they may want to talk as well. Mr. Bracy, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. This has been hard on me. Losing a lot of sleep, fear for my life. I grew up never thinking this would be me. I never had a gun pulled out on me. But to have several guns is devastating. The first thing I thought of when I looked in my mirror and when they pulled me over, I thought, you know, what did I do wrong? I'm waiting on an officer to come to my car and explain to me. Instead, I look in my mirror. I see shotguns. I see a handgun pointed at me. 55 years old. 2 sons, and a brand new grandson. And in my mind, I'm wondering if I'm going to make it out of there. Now, I got out of there by the grace of God. But to be frank, I really think I got out of there because I had the mailman uniform. I was just another black man trying to go home from work after spending 21 years here in Marin County working as a United States Postal Service carrier. And it's just devastating to me each and every day. I lose sleep constantly. I take the medication, but you know, it's just hard. I mean, not even a month ago after this happened, I was driving to get something to eat, and I see a DUI checkpoint on the opposite side. What happens to me? My mind wanders. Instead, I refused to come back home that way. I went all the way around because I was too nervous of the police department. And that's the fear I have right now today. Is fearing the police. And honestly, all I want is my life back. And I don't see how that's going to happen. Because this is a scar that's, I don't think, it'll never go away. This is my son, Brandon Bracy.
Tell us who you are.
My name is Brandon Bracy. Good afternoon. Yeah, man, it's been tough. I remember I got the phone call that night. I was with my son. He's 1.5 right now. I was with him, playing around, in a good mood. And then I get a phone call from my dad, and he was basically explaining what happened. And so now, my whole mood was killed that whole night. I am thankful that it wasn't worse, but it's still something that could have, it can mess you up mentally. And so, ever since then, me and him been talking on the phone and, just checking on him, making sure he's okay. I have a little brother who's on his way back up here. He'll be here tomorrow. But ever since the incident, it's been tough on the family just because, even me, he talked about the DUI checkpoint. Even me, when I'm riding around and I see a cop car, I get completely nervous. I turn the music down, even though I know I'm not doing anything wrong or speeding or breaking the law. There's still a more sense of nervousness just because my father just went through a situation with guns pointed at him and thrown in the back of a cop car. So, for me, it's tough because now, like you said, I have a son. That's his grandson. He's 1.5, and at some point he's gonna go from being just a cute child to a threat just because of the color of his skin. That's tough for me to accept, but it's also a reality. So, I don't wish that on nobody, regardless of the race. And I think, something definitely has to be done. Some people, may look at it and say, oh, well, it's nothing, he was released, but at the same time, they don't understand the mental effect that it can have on not just him, but the rest of my family and also everybody in our community that knows us. We do have a well-known last name in our community, and this sends a terrible effect on us mentally. So I just hope things get better, and I also hope that justice is served for my father.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Bracy. This is a terrible incident. We trust and believe in the police department in every city and area. My brother Karl, I was the first one he saw when he came home to me. It took him about 20 minutes to get it out of him. I kind of got a little upset with him because it took so long. But when he told me about it, you never think it gets this close to home. And I know he said he made it out of there, but he's still there. He lives with me. He's an outgoing guy. He has changed. He's more quiet, settled. He goes to bed early. He doesn't want to go out and get things to eat or go out anywhere because of fearness. Now, I'm a gentleman that has never been arrested, never been involved with the police department. But I see it on TV, but since this incident, it has got me a little concerned, not only for him, for everyone, but myself. This nation has to pull together. You got all the information. You can tell this is an accident, or not an accident, but the wrong guy they got. And good thing he's a guy that doesn't have outbursts, because if he could have made the wrong move, this could have been a whole different story. We could be standing somewhere else besides right here on this corner. And everybody has to realize that. And I have 4 boys. When they learned how to drive, I had to sit each one of them down to explain to them what happens when you get pulled over by an officer. And really, we shouldn't have to do that because that's not in the DMV handbook. But we have to share that with our African-American teenagers. So at the same time, he's still in that area even though he made it out. And justice does need to be served. It has to be served. This has to be an example that officers cannot use their authority whenever they want. I wanted to be an officer myself. The only reason why I didn't is 2 of my boys told me, Dad, do not do that. The fear of me, the fear of them, and now that the example we're having in this day and time, it makes me feel like I made the right choice. But then again, it makes me feel like I should have made that choice because I could have been an officer that could have made a difference. And we need those officers. And again, justice needs to be served. That's all I have.
So you can see that Mr. Bracy, not only is a decent man himself, he has a decent family, he's a law-abiding person, and what happened to him happens a lot to African Americans, but they don't have the opportunity to come forward and have a case or to be able to protest. But this is the kind of thing that has to be stopped, because this is racial profiling, whether you want to admit it or not. Because he was only stopped as a black man in a white car when there was no facts, none, that would support his being stopped and detained. The fact that the car was white, it could have made a determination very early that that car was not the same car. Or number two, they could have called in and gotten more information about it. Or number three, they could have called in on dispatch and found out the registration of that car, which we know routinely occurs. So it was kind of a laziness on their part. Why not? It's a hunch. Maybe we'll get lucky here. That's not how the policing is supposed to occur. You're supposed to have probable cause to do it. And it wasn't the kind of information that you needed in order to make that stop. So that's why we're here. And we understand the police have a position with just ordinary stuff. Well, what if you're lazy? What if you don't do what you're supposed to do? What if you didn't make the effort to find out information about that car? What if you didn't find out information about who the sailors were? What if you decided you didn't make any information about the registration, or you didn't acknowledge that the car was different? Is that excusable? If it brings harm to a particular person? The answer is hell no. Not in this America, and as long as I'm in a position to be talking about. So I answer any questions you may have. Yes. Well, here we filed a lawsuit, and that lawsuit will proceed along the normal course of events. I think the city itself probably ought to have some real discussions themselves about racial profiling, though everyone wants to deny its existence. But it does happen. I have an office full of it. I've had an office full for years and years and years. Not the people you see in the news that you read about and hear about. Those people are dead, generally. But the most cases we have are less than that. They're about people being stopped wrongfully. People being beaten up, falsely charged, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a community that has to take itself and look to see how it wants to improve the situation to minimize the likelihood of this happening in the future to other people. Any other questions?
What are you seeking from this lawsuit?
I'm sorry?
What are you seeking in this lawsuit?
Well, we have filed a lawsuit that seeks a violation of civil rights, the use of illegal arrest, illegal detention, and of course the issues of, to me, I want to look to see if there's any policy changes that can occur within the policing itself to give due consideration to questions that happen here. As to whether or not there's financial damage, you can see that's not the biggest deal here. The question here is, did this happen? Should it not have happened? And what can be done to prevent it from happening in the future? That's what I want the acknowledgement to take place. Anything else? Okay, yes. Are you a reporter?
No. I'm 74 and I've watched, and I've lived all over the country in Conference, Arizona, and I've watched the change and moving of policemen all over my lifetime. And I'm going to say this, I'm white, I'm a woman, and I've seen arrogance, meanness, mostly arrogance, just on the rise for years. And out of that arrogance comes the ability to say, I'm okay.
Absolutely. It's built into the process. You're absolutely right. What you've seen, I've seen as well. Although I must admit that there's a lot of efforts made to address those issues. And it unfortunately takes lawsuits in order to address themselves. And or now with, and I do hope with George Floyd that, as I said earlier, whether that's a moment or a movement remains to be seen. That's the community people to actively involve themselves, because you do not want what has happened to here to Mr. Bracy or to George Floyd and all the others It just be a moment where you protest, but no changes take place as a consequence. That requires community activity and community support. Okay? Thank all of you. Thank you.
So sorry.